Recording
Okay.
in progress.
So let's start over here. We left it in the middle. So we'll start on Yud Aleph Amud Beis. In the middle of the discussion, the Gemara discusses what does it mean in the Megilah. It says, in those days, Kisheves HaMelech. Kisheves HaMelech means, as the Gemara explains, La'achar shenis yashva daitoi. He come down. His mind, he settled in. Achashverosh, as Rashi explains, was worried. The Jewish people were told that after 70 years of the exile, they're going to go back to the land of Israel. The exile of Bavel was going to last for 70 years. But at that point, he calmed down because he calculated and he realized that the 70 years are up. And he saw that the Jewish people did not go back to Eretz Yisrael. So he said, okay, I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's after. So this is what it means. Kisheves HaMelech. Kisheves HaMelech Achashverosh means la'achar shenisyashva daitei. After he calmed down, he felt that now he's secure. He felt that now he was safe. Why? Because his predecessor name was Belshazzar. The Babylonian government, first there was Nebuchadnezzar, then was his son Evil Meroidach. We'll see it on the Gemara. It's confusing. It's very confusing, but we'll go slowly. So there was Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel. His son was Evil Meroidach. Evil, almost like evil. The evil Meroidach, Evil Meroidach. And then there was Belshazzar. Belshazzar was the third one. So Belshazzar, he took some of the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar robbed when he exiled the people from Israel, from Jerusalem to Babylonia. He exiled them to Iraq, it's Babylonia. And when he exiled them, he took along some of the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash. But during the whole time, they were afraid to use those vessels because they knew that the prophecy said that after 70 years, they were going to go back to Israel. So they were afraid to use the vessels of the Holy Temple for their things because not to anger Hashem, because they're still going to go back and they're going to belong to the Jewish people. But Belshazzar figured out, as we'll see in the Gemara, he says, well, the 70 years are up and the Jewish people have not gone back to Israel. They're not gone back to Israel. So he said, you know what? They're not going back to Israel at all. So he felt free to go ahead and take out those vessels, and he used them for the party that he made. And later on, as we read in Daniel, in the prophet Daniel, he was severely punished for that because, as the prophet tells him, for using the dishes, the utensils that belong in the Beis Hamikdash for his party. So Belshazzar was punished. Why? Because Achashverosh argued that he miscalculated. He thought the 70 years were up, and because he thought the 70 years were up, and the Jewish people did not go back, he said 70 years, and they didn't go back to Israel, that means they're not going back anymore. and therefore he can do whatever he wants with the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash. But he made a bad mistake. So now Achashverosh, he calmed down. Why? Because he figured, he says, Belshazzar, he made a mistake. He miscalculated. But I am not going to miscalculate. I am going to give the right cheshbon, the right accounting. 70 years have passed, and the Jewish people have not gotten back to Eretz Yisrael. He takes out all the dishes. Achashverosh makes this big party. And part of the dishes that he used over there, that he took out, were the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash that Nebuchadnezzar robbed. But the truth is that he mistaken too, because the Jews were. So now we're going to go through this whole numbers. Now, the truth of the matter is, within the prophets, in Daniel, in Malachim, in Yirmiyah, in Yecheskel, all of the prophets, there is conflicting dates and conflicting times. Some of it, most of it will be reconciled over here in the Gemara. The Gemara will put, but there's just a lot of different verses in the various prophets, which can lead, first of all, to the mistakes, and also to sort of sort it out, to know what belongs where. Just generally speaking, there were two exiles that Nebuchadnezzar exiled the Jewish people from Israel. There was the first exile, that is known as the Golus Yehoyakim. Golus Yehoyakim. Yehoyakim was the king of Yehuda. He was a descendant of Shlomo HaMelech, of King David. His son was Yehoyachin. We'll see soon in the Rashis in the Gemara. And Nebuchadnezzar exiled Yehoyachin. 11 years later, he came back and exiled the rest of the people. The first exile, he didn't exile them all, only a portion, a section of them. In the second exile, he exiled most of the leadership, most of the Talmidei Chachamim. He exiled. He only left very few people, the unimportant people. He left them in Jerusalem, but everybody else he exiled. That is known as the Golus Tzidkiyahu. Tzidkiyahu was the king that followed Yehoyachin. So again, the kings of Yehuda were Yehoyakim. His son was Yehoyachim, and then followed Tzidkiyahu. So some of the confusing statements that we'll read is because there's different exiles. There's the exile of what's called Golus Yehoyachin, and then there's the exile, what's called the Golus Yehoyakim. And all this, add to that, is the confusion of the different numbers that it says of Nebuchadnezzar. So let's go slowly, a little bit at a time. I'm just giving to you because we're going to have all these details are going to come into place. But first, again, this is back still what we learned last week. Kisheves means la'achar shenisyash v'daita. He relaxed. Omar, because he said, this is what Achashverosh said. Belshazzar, who was the king after Evil Merodach, Nebuchadnezzar, Evil Merodach, and Belshazzar, Choshav, he calculated V'to, and he made a mistake. He didn't get it right. And therefore, because he didn't get it right, we read in Daniel that Daniel rebukes him and punishes him for using the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash. He also calculated, and he thought, since the 70 years are up and the Jewish people have not been brought back to Israel, that means the prophecy is never going to happen. I don't have anything to worry about. So he said he made a mistake He says, Ano chashivna. I will calculate the loy to'ina. I'm not going to make a mistake. So the Gemara goes back. This is what we're up to. He says, Mahi. First, the Gemara wants to know, what is it? What is it? Rashi says, Mahi chushbenei de Balshetzar v'to'usei. What was Balshetzar's calculation? What did he calculate? And what was his mistake? What's going on up here? So the Gemara says like this. There is two verses. There is one verse, the Kesiv. This is a pasuk in Yirmiyah, Perek Chavtes pasuk Yud. Over there in Yirmiyah Chavtes pasuk Yud, it says, you want to read the whole verse? It says, Kichoy Omar Hashem, so says Hashem, Ki lifi melois lebavel shivim shana. Once there is 70 years filled to Bavel, Efkoid eschem, I will remember you. V'hakimoisi aleichem as devori hatoiv, I will stand up my good words, lahoshiv eschem el hamokoim hazeh, to bring you back to this place. So basically, the person in Yirmiyah says, Ki lifi melois lebavel shivim shana efkoid eschem. Once 70 years are filled to Bavel, in other words, once Bavel, you will be in the Bavel for 60 years, Bavel will be dominating you for 70 years, then Efkoid Eschem, then I'll remember you. Bring you back, as we read in the full pasuk, I'll bring you back to Eretz Yisrael. Now, what exactly does it mean here when Bavel fills 70 years? So there was time that the government of Bavel started. The government of Bavel started, Nebuchadnezzar. He conquered, like we read the story in Yonah, the city of Nineveh, the Ir Gedolah. That was the Melech Ashur. That was the Assyrian king. That was the king of Nineveh. So Nebuchadnezzar conquered him and then became the king of Bavel. That's when Bavel, when they overran the Assyrian empire, that's when Bavel became. So the assumption here is 70 years from when Bavel started, which the kingdom of Bavel, which was when Nebuchadnezzar became the king of Bavel. If you calculate from that time 70 years, that is the mistake that he made, but that's not really what the pasuk meant. Let's first see. The first interpretation of the words Lifi Melois LeBavel Shivim Shono, that when Bavel fills 70 years, was understood from when Bavel begins, once Nebuchadnezzar became in charge of Bavel. That's what the verse means here. Rashi translates it very clearly. Kosovar who's he? Who's the he? Anybody want to say? Balshetzar. Because this is the mistake that Balshetzar made. Balshetzar thought the 70 years start. So he thought when it says Melois LeBavel means LeMalchus Bavel, to the kingdom, from the day that Bavel became the kingdom. As Rashi translated, Miyoim Shenotlo Bavel Malchus. That is from the day that Bavel became a kingdom. When did that happen? V'zeh Nebuchadnezzar, this Nebuchadnezzar, Notal Malchus, he took the kingdom, Me'asar Chidon Melech Ashur. Asar Chidon is the name of the king of Ashur, of Assyria. I think we'll see soon. That's the same Nineveh. We'll match it up in a minute. Rashi will bring it out. There's a lot of long Rashis over here, and it's confusing, but pretty sure. So filling for Bavel 70 years, he thought But once Bavel became a government, when did Bavel become a government? That is when Nebuchadnezzar took the government from Asar Chidon, who was the king of Ashur. Melech Asar Chidon, Melech Ashur. Okay. The Gemara immediately says he missed another pasuk. The Gemara quotes another pasuk now from Daniel, chapter 9, verse 2. Over there, the pasuk clearly states, Limlaois lechorvois Yerushalayim shivim shana. 70 years will be filled from the destruction of Yerushalayim. Not from the kingdom of Bavel, but from the destruction of Yerushalayim. He did not know of the verse that the 70 years over here isn't talking from the 70 years from when Nebuchadnezzar became king, but rather it's talking 70 years from the destruction of Yerushalayim, which happened 7 or 8 years later, as we'll see in a minute. What happened? First, we'll give you the general number, then we'll go down to the specifics. So, he says, Choshuv Arboin v'chomesh de Nebuchadnezzar. Because he thought from the day Nebuchadnezzar became king. And since Nebuchadnezzar was king for 45 years, so he counted. Now, the Gemara is going to explain soon in a minute how do we get the 45. But let's take the Gemara's word for now, till the Gemara is going to explain it. So he counted the 45 years of Nebuchadnezzar. That is, Belshazzar counted it. The Esrim Utlas and 23, the Evil Meroidach. Evil Meroidach, I said, told you, is Nebuchadnezzar's son. So 45, Nebuchadnezzar was king. 23, Evil Meroidach. So how much do we have? We have 68. 45 and 23 is 68, right? And again, Choshav, who is this? Belshazzar. That's the king now. Memhei de Nebuchadnezzar. 45 of Nebuchadnezzar's year. V'chov Gimel de Evil Meroidach. And 23 of Evil Meroidach. So today, you have 68. V'tarte the day. And 2 of his, of Belshazzar. Belshazzar was king for 2 years at that point, when he took out the vessels. Ha Shivim. This is 70. Now, after he took out the vessels, he was there for one more year and then he was gone. So he was 2 years over there. And the Gemara is going to explain now, how do we know the number of 45 for Nebuchadnezzar? How do we know 23 for Evel Meroidach? The Gemara is not going to prove the 2 of Belshazzar, but Rashi says here, V'tarti the day, 2 of his. Who's the day? This is, again, Belshazzar's. We come up with 70. Is the Ashkechon, the Belshazzar Molach Tlas Shnin. We find Belshazzar, he was king for 3 years. Where do we see that? The Ksiv, we see that he king for 3 years. The Ksiv, Besefer Daniel, it says in the Daniel Bishnas Sholish Lemalchus Belshazzar Hamelech, on the 3rd year of King Belshazzar, Chazoin Nira Elai, there was a vision appeared to me. Ani Daniel v'goimer, and that is when he's rebuking Belshazzar. The full pasuk reads, Bishnas Sholish Lemalchus Belshazzar Hamelech, Chazoin Nira Elai, Ani Daniel, Acharei Hanira Elai B'tchila. So it was after the first one. So you see clearly that he was 3 years over there. This was 2 of the 3 years that he was there. So how many years was he at that point? Apik Mona Debei Migdasho. He took out the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash. That no, the Nebuchadnezzar Rab. The Ishtamesh Behu. And he used them. And what happened? He was punished for that. So that's what Achashverosh said. He made a mistake. The Gemara is going to explain what his mistake was, because it wasn't 70 years from when Nebuchadnezzar became king, but rather it was 70 years from the destruction of Yerushalayim, as the Gemara will count. But first, the Gemara wants to know, Nebuchadnezzar min nolon da'arboin v'chamesh shonin malach. Where do we know this? That Nebuchadnezzar was king for 45 years. Where does that say? So the Gemara is going to bring down a statement now from the rabbis, a very strange statement about the exile of the Jewish people, which is going to shed light about how many years Nebuchadnezzar was king. Because this is what he says. Now, it seems so confusing. It says that the Jewish people Golu b'Sheva on the 7th year. It says again, Golu b'Shmoina, they were exiled on the 8th year. It says again, Golu b'Shmoina Esrei, they were exiled on the 18th year. Then it says another pasuk, Golu b'Tshah Esrei, they were exiled on the 19th. We have 7, 8, 18, and 19. What's going on over here? What are all these dates doing over here? So we have to split these 2 dates and these 2 dates. The 7th and the 8th, and the 18th and the 19th. We have to split them. We're going to do the Rashi. It's a long Rashi. Then we have to split the dates. They're talking about 2 different exiles. I told you before, originally they were exiled, which is called the Golus Yehoyachin. And then was the Golus Tzidkiyahu. There was a difference of 11 years between, we're going to see, we're going to prove all that from the Psukim. In the Rashi, we'll see. But I'm just telling you so that you'll know when we learn it. That the Golus Tzidkiyahu, the second Golus, took place 11 years after the Golus of Yehoyachin. And these 2, 7 and 8, is talking about the Golus Yehoyachin. 18 and 19 is talking about the Golus Tzidkiyahu, 11 years later. What does it mean, Golu b'Sheva, Golu b'Shmona? First, Rashi explains the 7th and the 8th really is talking about the same Golus. It's not a different Golus, even though we say it the 7th year, and then we call it the 8th year. What happened was like this. Nebuchadnezzar, when he became king, the first year, he didn't bother Yerushalayim. It's only on the 2nd year that he conquered Yehoyachin. Yehoyachin at the time was, hey, that's not fair. He's using the Arshkol Gemara. Very good. No. Yakim, you double check if I'm saying correct. I didn't use the Arshkol Gemara. I use the Rashi. I try to use the Rashi. Well, you check me up and tell me if I'm saying it correctly. Okay? Now, the Golus Yehoyachin, Yehoyachin, on the 2nd year, once Nebuchadnezzar became the king, it took the 2nd year is when he overran over Jerusalem, and he enslaved, and he became in charge over King Yehoyachin. Up till that time, King Yehoyachin was the king of Judah. He was the king of Yehuda. The Nebuchadnezzar conquered him on the second year. So therefore, when we say 7, we're talking about from the time that he conquered Yehoiakim. When we say 8, we're talking about the time he became king. Because he became king, so it's the same exile. 7 years after he conquered Yehoiakim, I'm not sure the word is conquered, but he dominated Yehoiakim. 7 years from that point, which is 8 years from when Nebuchadnezzar became king of Babel, because it's on the second year of his kingdom that he conquered Yehoiakim. Let's look now in Rashi inside and we'll see. Are you guys following along with me? Okay. Golu b'sheva, golu b'shmoina. So first Rashi says, Chad golusu. Stephen, look in the Rashi. You'll look in the Art Scroll later. See what the Rashi says. Look in the Rashi. He says, Chad, learn the Rashi. You see what Rashi says. How do you think the Art Scroll knows it from? Art Scroll knows it from the Rashi. It says, Chad golusu. Rashi says, this is really one golus. Sheva and Shmoina, even though it says 7 and 8, it's really one golus. Ukroi kodorish. He fixes it out. He expounds the verses to come up with this, which means when he says 7, 8, he's telling you the different psukim over there. Kesiv begolus Yehoiachin. Now, it's a similar word, but this is called Yehoiachin, and that's Yehoiakim. Yehoiachin is the son of Yehoiakim. So the verse states, when Yehoiachin was put into exile, it says there, Bishnas Shmoine Lemalchus Nebuchadnezzar. Over there, the verse uses Shmoine, right? Shmoine uses one. It says, on the 8th year to the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, and this is where, this is in the Sefer Melachim. So that's one place. Over there in the end of the book of Melachim, and the end of the book of Melachim. So in the end of the book of Melachim, it says Shmoina. That's in the book. And then again in the Sefer Yirmiyahu b'Sefer, over there it says, Asher Hegla Nebuzaradan. Nebuzaradan was the one that actually was the officer that exiled them. That was the name of the army chief of staff who actually exiled the Yidden. But over there it says Sheva, 7th year. So here it says 8th year that they were exiled, and there it says 7. The difference is it's 8 years Ela Shemoina Lemalchus Nebuchadnezzar. 8 years is when Nebuchadnezzar became king, and Sheva is Lekibush Yehoiakim. 7 is when Yehoiakim was subdued, when he was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, which was the 2nd year. Shekov Shoy Tachtov, he conquered him, he made him underneath him. That was Bishana Shniya Lemalchusay, the 2nd in the kingdom. Originally is Veloy Higlohu, he never exiled him then. Nebuchadnezzar just put his rule over Yehuda, over Yehoiakim, but he left him in Yerushalayim. He was in charge still, but he conquered them, that it was under Nebuchadnezzar. By he loy eved sholish shonim. So we'll see later on. For 3 years, he was his slave. He was his slave. As the pasuk said, that's a pasuk. He was a slave. Who was a slave? King Yehoiakim was a slave to Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years. At the 3rd year, we'll see, it doesn't say in Rashi, we'll see later on. On the 3rd year, he rebelled. Yehoiakim. And that's when, later on, the 7th year, 3 years he was under him. And then 4 years later, he sent everybody into exile. That's when Nebuchadnezzar got angry. First, he served them, they were under him. And then he exiled them later on. So now you know the meaning of the words Golu b'Sheva, Golu b'Shmoina. They're talking about the same exile. 7 years from the time that Yehoiakim was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, and 8 years since Nebuchadnezzar became king, same time. What does it mean? Golu b'Shmoina Esrei and Golu b'Tshah Esrei. You guessed it. It means exactly the same thing. Because this was 11 years later. If you start from 7 and 11 is 18, right? 7 and 8 is 19. So 11 and 7 is 18, right? And 11 and 8 is 19. That's why we find 2 psukim. Again, in one pasuk it says Shmoina Esrei, and the other one it says B'Tshah Esrei. This is already talking about the exile of Tzidkiyahu, the second one. 11 years later took place the second exile, that he exiled them again. Those that were left over. The first exile was called what again? What did I call it? What was the first exile called? That was called the Golus Yehoiakim. And the second exile was called the Golus Tzidkiyahu. 11 years later. Golu b'Sheva, Golu b'Shmoina talks about the Golus Yehoiakim. Golus b'Shmoina Esrei, Golu b'Tshah Esrei talks about the Golus of Tzidkiyahu. Rashi. The Yudches v'Yutes Ksiv b'Golus Tzidkiyahu, the 18 and 19 is written by the Golus Tzidkiyahu, and that's written the Sefer Yirmiyah, the end of the book of Yirmiyah. In chapter 52, I believe over there, the Torah says, and that is what the pasuk refers to, V'hainu churvas Yerushalayim. Those are the destructions, the rubbles, and the destruction of Yerushalayim. Because like I said before, in the first Golus, he sent away only some of the people. But in this time, this was already the rubbles and the destruction of Yerushalayim. Shahid, this took place, Yud Aleph Shana Achar Golus Yehoiakim. This was 11 years after the exile of Yehoiakim. That was the Golus Tzidkiyahu. The Ksiv, the pasuk says that. It says, Vayhi be'ashtei esrei shana lemelech Tzidkiyahu. It was 11 years to the king of Tzidkiyahu. Nebuchadnezzar had placed Tzidkiyahu as the king after he removed Yehoiakim. First Yehoiakim and then his son Yehoiakim. He placed Tzidkiyahu, he exiled Yehoiakim the first time around. At that time when he exiled Yehoiakim, he put in King Tzidkiyahu, he put him in charge of Eretz Yisrael. 11 years after Tzidkiyahu was king in Yerushalayim, he exiled him. So the pasuk says over there, 18 years for Nebuchadnezzar, 19 years. What is 18 and 19? So what is 18 and 19? Yudches likibush Yehoiakim. 18 is from when the time Nebuchadnezzar conquered Yehoiakim. And the Yutes, and the 19 is the Malchus Nebuchadnezzar. That's to the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. So let's see in the Gemara. So the Gemara says like this. Golu b'Sheva. So what does it mean? 7. 7 means l'kibush Yehoiakim. That is when he conquered the second year, as Rashi said, Yehoiakim. That is when the Golus Yehoiakim took place. The Golu, 7 years after conquering Yehoiakim, was Golus Yehoiakim. Shehi Shmoin Nebuchadnezzar. That's 8 from when Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar conquered Yoyakim 1 year after he became king. Galu b'shmoine esrei. What does it mean, the exile end? L'kibush Yoyakim. From the time the Yoyakim, they exiled the Golus Sitkiyahu, that was the second one. She'it Shah esrei l'Nebuchadnezzar, which is the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, who said that he conquered Yoyakim on the second year? I mean, we're saying 7 and 8 or 18 and 19. It's all because the kibush Yoyakim took place at the second year. How do we know that? So it says, there's a statement of the rabbis. It said that Shana Rishoina Kibesh Ninveh. So I made a mistake before. I confused this. When I said he took the kingdom away from the other king that Rashi brought down before, he took it away from, forget the name over there, Asar Chidon. That was the Melech Ashur. But here we're talking what he did on his first year of his government. What he did is Kibesh Ninveh. That's when he conquered the synagogue of Ninveh. Shahoiso Roish Malchus Ashur. Because over there also it says that he took it away from Asar Chidon, but then I guess in the first year, once he took it away, he conquered Ninveh, the Ir Gedolah Ninveh, which was the head of the Assyrian government. Shahoya Melech Beninveh, because there was a king in Ninveh. And I think that means that's why it was the head of the Malchus Ashur, or he's saying that the Nebuchadnezzar became king in Nineveh. No, I think he was just saying that the Malchus Ashur had a king in Nineveh. That was the head of the Malchus. Maybe you can enlighten us from there. It seems like Rashi is saying that it was the head of the kingdom of Ashur who had the king in there. Because we read the whole story, the Melech Nineveh with Yonah coming to tell him to do tshuva in Ashur. But either way, the Shaniah, so that's what he did in the first year. And the second year was Kibush Yoyakim. He conquered Yoyakim in Yerushalayim. So that's how we know that it was the second year, because the first year he conquered Nineveh, and the second year he conquered Yoyakim. Rashi brings out a long Rashi here. Shaniah Kibush Yoyakim. So how do we know this? Good question. We just quoted a statement that the first year he conquered Nineveh, and the second one he conquered Yoyakim. How do we know this? And the Gemara says, Rashi brings down that Kroi Kodorish v'Seder Olam. Seder Olam is a book, is a sefer, which gives you the order of the world, puts in chronological dates, everything of the Tanakh, how it happened. That's called Seder Olam. That's the order of the world. That gives you when Avram was born, when Yitzchak was born, when Adam, the whole chronological order of the whole Torah. It's called Seder Olam. So in Seder Olam, he expounds, he figures out things from the Psukim. Because Ksiv Beroish Sefer Daniel, in the beginning of the book of Daniel, it says, Bishnas Sholish Lemalchus Yehoyakim. It says, on the third year of the government of Yoyakim. So Yoyakim was a king in Yehuda, right? And then on the third year after he's governing, Bo Nebuchadnezzar B'Yerushalayim. So Nebuchadnezzar came to Yerushalayim. This seems to say that Yoyakim was a king for 3 years. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes to Yerushalayim. Vayitein Hashem es Yoyakim b'yodei. And Hashem gives Yoyakim in his hand. He conquers Yoyakim. Seems from this pasuk that for 3 years Yoyakim was able to rule, and after the 3 years, Nebuchadnezzar comes in. Says the Seder Olam. This is still from the Seder Olam. It says, Efshar Leimer came. Is it really possible to say that? How could he come after the third year of Yehoyakim? He wasn't even a king. Nebuchadnezzar never became king of Babel until Yehoyakim's fourth year. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a king. Yehoyakim was already 4 years a king before Nebuchadnezzar even became king. How could Nebuchadnezzar come on the third year of Yehoyakim when Nebuchadnezzar wasn't even king until 4 years of Yehoyakim? Shenamar, who says Sefer Yirmiyahu, Hadavar asher haya b'shnas harvis leHayakim. This is that happened on the fourth year to Yehoyakim. Hishana Rishona Nebuchadnezzar, which was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar. So there's something wrong over here. So the Gemara says like this. So what does Seder Olam explains like this? He says, of course, Yehoyakim was the first king for 3 years. And then Yehoyakim became, and then Nebuchadnezzar became king. On the fourth year of Yehoyakim, that is when he became a king. And then, so what does it mean 3 years later? 3 years means after he rebelled. Because first he conquered him. And then, what does it mean 3 years to King Yehoyakim? Bishnas shloisha lemordei. That is 3 years after Yehoyakim rebelled, which means first Yehoyakim was a king. Then Nebuchadnezzar became a king. On the second year after Nebuchadnezzar became a king, he conquered Yehoyakim. After conquering Yehoyakim for 3 years, Bishnas shloisha lemordei, after 3 years that he rebelled, it says, La'achar shekivshoy avdei shalosh shonim umarad bay. So for 3 years, he put him in place. He conquered him, but he let him stay. And then after 3 years, he rebelled against him. La'achar shekivshoy umarad bay. As the pasuk says, Vahilo Yehoyakim eved shalosh shonim. He was his servant for 3 years. By Yoshav and returned by Yimrad by. Supposing Malachim base Chavdal Aleph. So Belimdach Khan. So here we said that Sha'omad b'merdei shalosh shonim. So over here you see that he rebelled for 3 years. So the pasuk, when the pasuk says Bishnas shloisha lemordei, over here when the pasuk says Bishnas shalosh lemalchus Yehoyakim, meaning he had like a new government. Yehoyakim's government started before Nebuchadnezzar even started. Then Nebuchadnezzar came in. On the second year Nebuchadnezzar came in, he conquered Yehoyakim. Yehoyakim was with him for 3 years. The pasuk says here, Bishnas shalosh, the Malchus Yehoyakim, that after 3 years he rebelled. So this pasuk is telling us 3 years he was with him, and 3 years he rebelled. So now we have 6 years since he was conquered. He conquered him, and he worked for him for 3 years and rebelled 3 years. But at this time, Nimser b'yodei, he was given over in his hand, which means Yehoyakim was given over in the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, and he killed him. The Niskayim boy, and it was fulfilled because the pasuk says, Kvuras chamoir yikover. That was prophesied by Yirmiyah Chabeis Pasuk Yutes, he says about King Yoyakim, he says, Hadovar Kvuras Chameri Kover, Schoy V'Hashlich, Mahol Sharish Laim, that he's going to be buried like a donkey, which means not going to come to burial normally. Okay, so what did he do? V'himlich. So Nebuchadnezzar, after Yoyakim, he killed him. He made as Yoyakim benoi Tachtov. He made his son Yoyakim a king instead of Yoyakim. He placed, because he rebelled after 3 years rebelling, he killed Yoyakim and put his son Yoyakim. Then it says, Obalei leBavel. This is in the Medrash Rabbim. It does. Came to Bavel. Amru leYoyetzav. So his advisor said to Nebuchadnezzar, Ha'ab Moradbach. The father rebelled against you because 3 years rebelled. Yimlachta benoi, and then you go and you make his son Yoyachin, you make him to a king. Masla Amron. There's a mashal says, the example, the parable says, Mekalba Bisha, Gurya Tovil Anafik. From a bad dog, good poodles will not come. In other words, if the father is bad, Yoyakim was bad, Yoyakim ain't going to be any good. So when the year turned around, he went back, Viglo, and he exiled whom? Yoyakim. That was the exile of Yoyakim. 7 years, 6 and 1, because after the year, that was him. The Himlich Tzidkiyahu, and that's, he left Tzidkiyahu in Israel to be the king, Yehuda to be the king. V'chein kosiv b'sefer Malachim b'soifei, so it says in the book of Malachim. Nimtzes, so it turns out that Golus Yoyachim was b'shas sheva l'kibush Yoyakim. That Yoyachin exile was 7 years after Yoyachin was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. 3 and 3 plus 1. But Akosu Koida Oisoi b'shas shmoina l'malchus Nebuchadnezzar b'sefer Malachim b'soifa. So, but it still calls it 8 years to the government of Nebuchadnezzar. So that's what we know, that it was in the 2nd year. Because otherwise, 8 years means to his government. So it means that he conquered Yehuda he exiled them 8 years from his kingdom because he conquered Yerushalayim, Yehuda, he conquered him on the year after he became king. So let's just go to the Gemara Ksiv. The pasuk says, "Vayhi b'shloishim v'sheva shana legolus Yoyachin melech Yehuda." So there was 37 years after Yoyachin, the king of Yehuda, after he was exiled. 37 years later, this was on the 12th day of the 12th month, on the month of Elul, or the month of Adar, on the 25th of the month of Adar, Nasa Evil Merodach Melech Bavel. So the king of Evil Merodach, the king of Bavel, he forgave Bishnas Malchusa Yisrosh Yoyachim Melech Yehuda, the king of Yoyachim Melech Yehuda. He took him out of jail. Because when he exiled him, he put him into jail. So after 37 years in exile, when they left, the 7th year for Nebuchadnezzar, 8th year, they left it, so he forgave him. So, so this teaches us, Shemelech Evil Meroidach, so that, because that happened when he became king, he forgave him. So we know that the king Evil Meroidach became 37 years Legolus Yoyachim. Right? It was 37 years to Golus Yoyachim. because at that year, when he became king, that's what the pasuk says, then he forgave him. So we know that Evel Meroidach became king at 37 years from the exile of Yochim. Ukvar Melech Nebuchadnezzar, and we know that Nebuchadnezzar was Shmeina Shodim Koidem Golus Yochim. He was 8 years before, as we proved before. On the second year, he conquered him, and 7 years later, so he was like Bishmeina. So it was Shmeina, Velamet Zayin. How much is 8 and 37? Hare Mem Hey. So you have 45. Okay. Because you have 37 of 37 from Golos by Melech Evel Meroidach. And we know Nebuchadnezzar goes back 8 years, is 45. And then you have the 23 years of Evel Meroidach, 45 and 23, we said before, is 68, who based the Balshetzar. So Tamani, 8. 8 of whom? The 8 of Nebuchadnezzar until Golus Yoyachin. Utlosim v'sheva, and the 37 of Evel Meroidach. Hararboim v'chomish, the Nebuchadnezzar. So you have 45 of Nebuchadnezzar. V'esen utlas the Evel Meroidach Gemara. How do we know 23 Evel Meroidach? Because that is, it says, we just says 23. That's by tradition. The Tarti Didei, and 2 of Balshetzar, Hashivin, we have 70. Omar, so he said, Balshetzar, Hashtabadai Sulam Mifriki, now they're not going to be freed. Apik Mona de Bei Magdasha, I'll take out the vessels of the Mesa Migdosh, Veshtamish, and I'll use them. How did the common Daniel? That's what Daniel says to him, and Daniel, hey, Pasuk of Gimel, you've been arrogant, again, the master of the heaven. And the vessels of his house, you placed before you. And it says in Daniel, hey, Pasuk Lamed, Bei Balayla, and that night, Kotel Bal Shetzar Malko Kashdoi. The Kashdoim, they killed him that night because of what he did, that he took out the vessels. They killed him that night. Uksiv, and it says further in Daniel Bav Aleph, v'deryavush mado kibel malchusa, kibar shnin shitim v'tartin. When he received the government, that he was 62, shitim v'tartin. So what he said, Omar, what Achashverosh said, ihu mitito. He made a mistake. Omar Achashverosh, ihu bade mitito. I'm not going to make a mistake. Because Miksiv Lamalchus Babel doesn't say to when government Babel. The Babel Ksiv. My Babel Gabel's Babel. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to stop over here. It was a lot for one day. I hope that we were able to get some of it, but we can redo it again next time if it's valuable. Or we can just go on. And this is just trying to prove from the different verses, all the different numbers that we're talking about over here. So, with the Tanakh and with the Psukim, I try to go through it, and I think it's pretty clear from the way Rashi explains it and the Gemara, but there's just a lot of information and a lot of accounting. So I'm not sure. I guess, okay, we'll see next week. Maybe we'll redo it, or we'll go weiter. We'll make a decision about that. But as we do usually, I like to give over. It's very late now. I like to give over a small part of the parsha, an inspiring word of the parsha from the Rebbe's talks. That so of course in the parsha by Yigash. So maybe I want to mention. Today is the 4th day of Tevis tonight already. The 5th day of Tevis is a a special day in the Chabad calendar. You may know there was a challenge to the books of the Rebbe's library. The previous Rebbe had 3 daughters. One of them was married to Rabbi Hornstein. Fortunately, they passed in the Holocaust. They were murdered by the Nazis, Yimach Shemam. But the Rebbe married the middle daughter. And the older daughter married Rabbi Gurari. After the passing of the previous Rebbe, it became clear that the Rebbe is the one, even though the Rebbe was the younger son-in-law, but that the Rebbe was the one qualified to become the Rebbe. And Rabbi Gurari, unfortunately, as you know, while the Rebbe had many spiritual children, but the Rebbe didn't have any biological children. And Rabbi Gurari had 1 son. And while Rabbi Gurari himself accepted the Rebbe as the Rebbe, but his son, his name was Berry, Shalom Ber, after his preacher of his father, he never agreed to it. At some point, there was an extensive library, very expensive library. They found that, or books that from the library, of the previous Rebbe's library, are being sold on the market, in the antiques market. So they put up videos. Anyways, they found out that he was taking the books and he was selling them. And it was a big court case. And basically what it boiled down to, the question is, who do the books belong to? Do they belong to the personal assets of the previous Rebbe? And that would mean that the grandson had rights. I mean, two living children, both daughters. So he would have entitled to it. Or that these books belong to Chabad as an organization. They weren't the personal property of the Rebbe. This is a whole court case. And anyways, so on the 5th day of Teves, the court ruled in favor of the Rebbe and in favor of Chabad. And this day was known as the Yom Tov of Didan Notzach. We were victorious. And the Rebbe wanted to, it's a whole story you can read up online and everything else, but the Rebbe wanted that people should buy books and learn books and fill their homes with Jewish books. The idea is make your home a holy home. The Rebbe says to me, besides the mezuzah that we need, but we should have a bayis mali svarim, a house full with books. So there's a lot of sales going on between different booksellers, up to almost 50% off in different books. So I just want to mention this day, and I want to encourage people to maybe buy an extra book, an extra sefer, and learn in it. And hopefully all of our efforts together will bring some light into our dark world. We read all kinds of crazy stuff going on, and hopefully that we can bring about light and goodness and bring Mashiach down to the world. Got to run, make my minyan over here. So I will say good night, and I'll see everybody in Mitzvah Hashem next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, same time, same station, Mitzvah Hashem. And hope you enjoyed the class today, Stephen. And the only way I'll know if you'll come back next week. We'll see. Have a good night, everybody. Good night. Have a good night. Good night. You want to say something?